Autumn fog lay white over the Flathead River like a vast veil spread across the water. Brianna Kessler sat on a small wooden dock, fishing rod in hand, her eyes fixed on the distance, toward the valley where rows of pines stood around it like the walls of an ancient cathedral. Behind her, the little log cabin breathed out the scent of pine and old paper. On the dock, Josie, her 7-year-old daughter, lay on her stomach with a colored pencil pinched between smudged fingers, drawing an airplane in a worn notebook with frayed corners. Birdsong carried through the quiet. The river's surface was flat as glass, reflecting the sky and the far mountains drowning in mist. In that moment, the world felt both small and strangely safe, as if nothing could reach the two of them anymore. Then the sky was torn open. The roar of an engine split the silence, not the sound of an ordinary car, but metal screaming at uncontrollable speed, tires clawing at the road like the cry of a wounded beast. Brianna snapped her head up. On the bridge upstream, a black SUV shot through the guardrail at a terrifying pace, ripping apart the steel barrier, flying off the roadway as if an invisible hand had flung it down. The vehicle spun half a turn in midair, its nose pitching downward, then crashed straight into the river. The explosion of sound was deafening. Water erupted several yards into the air. Waves rolled toward the dock, rocking the old fishing boat hard. Josie's panicked scream cut through everything, and the drawing notebook slipped from the boards. Brianna shouted for her to stay on the dock, to not go into the water, to listen and not move, and then she threw herself into the river. The water struck like 1,000 needles. The cold stole her breath at once. But Brianna didn't stop. She swam fast, arms driving, breaking the surface toward the SUV as it sank with frightening speed. Bubbles burst from the body of the car like the last breath of a dying monster. The stink of motor oil spread across the water, sharp and bitter, mixed with a rusty metallic taste. The closer she got, the more she could see. The roof had buckled. The glass was shattered. Water poured into the cabin with a force nothing could resist. Brianna pulled in one deep breath, so deep her lungs felt ready to split, and she dove. The world under the surface went dark. The river, usually clear, was now clouded with mud and oil. She could see only a hand's breadth ahead. Her eyes burned. Her lungs began to sear. Still, she swam. In the cold darkness, her hands groped forward. Her fingers scraped sharp metal, brushed broken glass, then found something soft and warm, human skin. Then she saw him. Inside the SUV, a man was trapped. His face was covered in blood, his eyes half closed, half open, the seatbelt cinched tight across his chest. He struggled weakly. One hand clawed at the cracked window frame, fingers trembling as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. The water had reached his neck and rose higher by the second. Brianna grabbed the doorframe and yanked. The warped metal groaned but didn't give. She pulled again, this time with both hands, bracing her feet against the car for leverage. The door shuddered, but it stayed jammed. Her lungs burned. Her head began to spin. Darkness bled in at the edges of her sight, like ink in water. She knew she had only seconds left. Then instinct spoke. The instinct that had kept her alive through being 15 on the streets, through winter nights under bridges, through years when no one protected her but herself. Her right hand found the small knife she always kept in her pocket, an old switchblade, the blade shorter than her finger, the thing that had never left her since the night she ran from Carl Ferris's house at 15, climbed a barbed wire fence with blood streaming down her wrist. That knife wasn't a weapon. It was a promise she would never let herself be powerless again. Brianna cut the seatbelt. 1 slash, a second. The strap snapped. She hooked her arm under the man's chest, gripped his collar, then kicked hard and surged upward toward the surface, toward the pale light trembling through the water like a fragile vow. When they broke the surface, light detonated in Brianna's vision. She opened her mouth and gulped air, a long, desperate pull like someone drowning. Because she was drowning, she dragged the man with her, one hand keeping his head above water, the other pounding hard between his shoulder blades. He coughed. Once, water spilled out. He coughed again. Then he breathed. The first breath a harsh, whistling rasp, rough and raw and desperate. But it was breath. His eyes opened. Not the eyes of someone who had just escaped death, but eyes sharp, chillingly alert, as if even on the edge of dying he was still judging, still calculating, still in control. Those eyes locked onto Brianna's, and she felt something shiver along her spine. It wasn't fear. It was a sense, a warning from somewhere deep. that she had just pulled something far bigger than a single life up from the riverbed. She didn't know he was Cale Maddox, the kingpin at the head of the largest underground empire on the west coast of the United States, the man whose name could make the entire criminal world fall silent. She didn't know someone had cut the brakes on that SUV, that this wasn't an accident, but a failed assassination. She didn't know that saving him would drag her out of the hidden life she had spent 6 years building, hurling her into a storm of media, hatred, and secrets powerful enough to burn everything she had ever tried to protect. And she certainly didn't know that this man, the man coughing river water in her arms right now, held the key to a dark past she thought she had buried for good. A past tied to the garage where she once worked, to the numbers she once wrote into an old notebook, and to the real reason she was fired, threatened, and forced to disappear from the world. But wait, who was Cale Maddox really? Why did someone want him dead? And why would fate throw him into this river? Right in front of a woman who had spent her whole life running. A woman who wanted only one thing in this world: to be left in peace. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to support it, share it with anyone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the journeys ahead. The next morning, Brianna stood at the sink in the small kitchen, both hands held beneath the running tap. The water flowed down, carrying a pale pink tint, spreading like diluted ink across the white porcelain. Dried blood, blood from the cuts in her palms, where she had gripped the shattered car frame, where broken glass had sliced into her skin without her noticing until now. Brianna watched her hands tremble under the stream, watched the red scratches crossing her fingers, the backs of her hands, her wrists, right beside the old scar that had faded but never disappeared. She clenched her hands, then opened them, clenched them again, then opened them, as if trying to confirm they still belonged to her. These were the hands that had grabbed a stranger by the collar, that had hooked under his chest, that had hauled him up out of the water. It was the first time Brianna had touched a man since Travis. The last time she touched Travis was the night she ran, 5 months pregnant, her cheeks swollen and bruised, one hand clutching the only bag she had time to grab. Since that night, Brianna hadn't touched anyone. She hadn't shaken hands. She hadn't hugged anyone except Josie. Her body had become a fortress, with walls, with a moat, with gates sealed shut, and last night, she'd blown it all apart in a single moment, without thinking, without hesitation, just because a man was drowning. She turned off the tap and dried her hands on the old towel hanging nearby. Her hands still shook. On the small television perched on the wooden shelf in the corner of the kitchen, the newscaster's voice droned steadily. A mysterious accident on the Flathead Bridge. A black SUV plunged into the river last night. The victim was rescued by a local resident. The victim's identity is being verified. Brianna reached out and switched off the television before the announcer could say another word. She didn't want to know. She didn't want to hear a name. She didn't want to see that face on the screen. She'd pulled him out. He was alive. That was enough. In her experience, knowing too much about someone was never a good thing. Knowing too much had cost her a job. Knowing too much had once earned her death threats. And knowing too little about the people she trusted had left her with cracked ribs while 5 months pregnant. No, Brianna didn't need to know. She just needed peace. The small kitchen, filled with morning light filtering through lace curtains. Josie sat at the wooden table, her legs swinging above the floor, a colored pencil clutched in her smudged fingers. She was drawing last night from the memory of a 7-year-old child, blue river water, a black car, and a figure swimming out into the current. Long hair floating, larger than the car itself. That was her mother. In Josie's drawings, her mother was always bigger than everything else. Brianna poured coffee into an old ceramic mug, the thick kind bought at a thrift store for 50 cents, then sat down across from her daughter. The small cabin breathed out the smell of pine and old paper, a scent that had become this home's breath. Wooden walls, wooden floors, a small bookshelf packed with Josie's picture books, and a few repair manuals Brianna knew by heart. In the kitchen drawer, among old utility bills and Josie's messy drawings, lay a worn brown notebook with taped binding and yellowed edges. That notebook had followed Brianna through 5 moves, through nights sleeping in her car, through shelters, through cheap rented rooms, and finally here, lying quietly among ordinary papers as if it too were ordinary. But it wasn't. Brianna just didn't know that yet. She took a sip of coffee and looked out the window. The Flathead River lay still beyond the line of pines, its surface smooth as if nothing had ever happened. No explosion, no black SUV spinning through the air, no one almost dying. But Brianna knew better than anyone that some wounds never heal. They only learn how to be silent. Life here was so simple it was nearly invisible. Brianna repaired machines for the locals, lawnmowers, chainsaws, sometimes an old pickup with an engine coughing like an elderly man with pneumonia. She worked with her hands, with instinct, with knowledge she'd taught herself, from years standing outside garage doors looking in. Then from 2 years at Ironclad Motors, where someone had paid her because she was good, not because they felt sorry for her. Hank Mercer, the town's grocery owner, was the only one who treated her like family. He set aside fresh milk for Josie every Tuesday morning, slipped it into a paper bag with a candy bar, and never charged her. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't ask why a 31-year-old woman lived alone in the woods with a small child, without a smartphone, without social media, without a single photograph of herself on the internet. He just said, "If you need anything, come by. The store's always open." Ron Whitfield, the repair shop owner, was the only one who gave her work when no one else would take a woman with no degree, no references, no verifiable work history. He watched her strip down a carburetor in 15 minutes, then nodded and said, "Come in tomorrow, 7 in the morning. Don't be late." That was everything Brianna had. A small cabin, a daughter, a kind grocery owner, a repair shop paying her $300 a week, and the quiet river outside her door. She'd built this life from nothing, from empty hands, from nights when Josie cried from hunger and all she could do was hold her and sing in a voice hoarse from crying too. She didn't need saving. She didn't need heroes. She didn't need 3 shiny black Cadillacs or thick envelopes or non-disclosure agreements. She needed only one thing in this world, to be left in peace. But that peaceful life wasn't something Brianna was born with. It was something she wrestled from fate, piece by piece, with blood, with tears, with long nights that felt as if morning would never come. To understand why Brianna Kessler chose to live like a ghost among the Montana pines, you have to go back to a winter night 25 years ago, when she was only 6. In a small house in the suburbs of Sacramento, snow falling outside the window, Brianna lay curled on her bed with a teddy bear missing one eye when a sound from downstairs pulled her upright, not shouting, not breaking dishes like the other times. This time it was the sound of something dropping, heavy, dull, like a sack thrown onto the floor. Then silence, a silence more terrifying than any scream. Brianna went down the stair, only the pale yellow glow from the lamp on the dining table spilled across the room, just enough for her to see her mother. Ada Kessler lay on the kitchen floor, hair fanned out across half her face, one arm stretched as if reaching for something, the other folded beneath her. Her eyes were open, but they weren't looking. Boyd stood by the sink, both hands braced on the counter, his back to his wife. His breathing was heavy, his shoulders shaking. He didn't turn around. He walked out the back door, got into the car, started it, and vanished into the snowfall. He never came back. Brianna didn't understand what had happened. She only knew her mother was on the floor and wasn't getting up. She knelt beside her, set her small hand on Ada's hand. Her mother's hand was still warm. Brianna held it, squeezed tight, and waited. She waited for her mother to open her eyes. She waited for her to say something. She waited for her to sit up and smooth Brianna's hair like she always did. But her mother didn't open her eyes. And the hand in Brianna's hand grew colder, colder, cold, until it no longer felt like her mother's hand at all, but like something made of wax, of stone, of a substance that didn't belong to this world. Brianna sat there all night. She didn't cry. She didn't call for anyone. She just held her mother's hand and waited. The next morning, a neighbor looked through the window, saw the kitchen light still on, knocked, then called the police. They had to pry Brianna's hand from Ada's. The little girl didn't scream, didn't fight. She only looked at them with the dry eyes of a 6-year-old who had understood something many adults never understand in a lifetime, that there are things which, once you let go, you can never hold again. After that came foster care. 4 families in 9 years. The first family was kind but poor, and they returned her after 8 months because they couldn't afford to feed one more mouth. The second treated her like an unpaid servant. The third was Carl Ferris's house. What happened in the Ferris home, Brianna never told anyone. She kept only the scar on her wrist, from the night she climbed a barbed wire fence to escape. 15 years old, blood running down her arm, bare feet on the streets of San Francisco. There was no 4th family, because Brianna never let anyone foster her again. She lived on the streets. She slept under bridges, in abandoned parking lots, behind restaurant dumpsters where she scavenged leftovers. She learned to fix cars by standing outside garage gates for hours at a time, memorizing every movement, every click of a wrench, every way a mechanic tilted his head to listen to an engine and guess what was wrong. She learned with her eyes, with her ears, with her hands feeling their way over discarded vehicles. When she was 21, she walked into Ironclad Motors in Oakland, wearing the cleanest clothes she had and hands more calloused than any mechanic her age. The manager watched her tear down a carburetor in 12 minutes, then nodded. She was hired. For the first time in her life, Brianna had steady work, a workbench, her name on a payroll, a reason to wake up each morning without having to ask herself where she would sleep that night. She loved the job. She loved the precision of mechanics, the cold logic of metal and motion, the way a broken engine could be diagnosed by pure reason, if you were patient enough to listen. And she wrote everything down in the worn brown notebook: vehicle numbers, plates, service schedules, technical notes. The habit came from foster care, where she learned that writing everything down was the only way to protect yourself when no one else would. 2 years later, she started noticing things that didn't add up. Cars brought in with no clear owner, cash changing hands with no invoices, plates changing again and again on the same vehicle. Strange men arriving at night, speaking in whispers with the manager, then disappearing. Brianna reported it upward. The manager looked at her with eyes cold as ice and told her to mind her own work and stop asking questions she shouldn't ask. A week later, she was fired. No explanation, no severance, only one sentence from the manager's mouth as she walked out the door. "If you open your mouth, no one will ever find you." Brianna took the notebook with her, the only thing left from the only stretch of time when she felt like she was someone, and she disappeared. After that came Travis, charming, gentle, then violent. Brianna ran in the middle of the night when she was 5 months pregnant, her cheek swollen and bruised, her ribs cracked. 3 months later, Travis died in a car accident. Brianna didn't cry. Josie was born in a small hospital in Missoula. Brianna lay alone on the delivery bed. No one held her hand. No one told her everything would be all right. There was only Josie's first cry ringing through the stark white room. And in that moment, for the first time in 20 years, Brianna cried. Not from pain, but because at last she had a reason to live. The sound of an engine carried up from the dirt road at around 10 o'clock the next morning. Brianna was out in the yard, both hands tight on the axe handle, the steel blade splitting a pine log with a clean, dry crack. Her flannel sleeves were rolled above her elbows, sweat beading at her hairline even though the early fall air still held a chill. Josie sat on the porch step with her sketchbook open on her lap, a colored pencil shading in a violet-pink sky that only a 7-year-old imagination would think to create. The engine noise grew louder. It wasn't the sound of an ordinary vehicle. It wasn't the familiar rattle of an old pickup or the logging trucks that passed through the valley. This was a low, steady, powerful growl, the kind of sound made by machines built to let you know something important was coming. Then 3 glossy black Cadillacs slid out between 2 rows of pines, sunlight striking their roofs so they flashed like 3 moving mirrors. Road dust lifted into thin ribbons, hanging in the light that filtered through the branches. Brianna set the axe down and wiped her hands on her jeans. Her heart beat faster, even though she wouldn't allow it to. The first car stopped only a few yards from the porch. The door opened. A man stepped out, and Brianna recognized him immediately, even though last night she had seen him only through murky water and blood. Cale Maddox, almost a head taller than her, broad-shouldered. The bruise at his temple had darkened to purple-black, and the white bandage on his jaw stood out against sun-bronzed skin. But his eyes held none of the look of a man who had nearly died. They were sharp, clear, certain, the eyes of someone used to controlling everything around him, even while standing in the yard of a stranger's home deep in the Montana mountains. He wore a black suit, the kind of fabric Brianna could identify at a glance as costing more than the battered old pickup parked beside the cabin. Behind him, another man got out of the second car, large, expression spare, eyes constantly sweeping the area as if assessing every blind spot in the yard. Connor Bryce. Then 2 more men stepped down from the third car, both in black suits, carrying leather briefcases and tablets. 4 men in expensive clothing stood in the yard of a mechanic living in a log cabin. The scene felt unreal, like a dream staged against the wrong backdrop. Cale walked up and stopped an arm's length from Brianna, then held out his hand. The handshake was firm and decisive, the kind of grip used to closing deals and ending arguments with nothing but pressure. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and clear, each word set in place like stones in a wall. "Then you disappeared before I could thank you. I wanted to come here and say it." Brianna pulled her hand from his, slow but final. "No need," she said. "I only did what anyone would do." Connor stepped forward, raising a thick envelope with both hands, as if presenting something ceremonial. "We want to compensate you for your bravery," he said, his tone smooth and professional. "And we're also asking you to sign a non-disclosure agreement, standard procedure for incidents connected to the company." Brianna didn't take the envelope. She didn't look at it. She looked straight into Cale's eyes, and something shifted in her expression. A small, dark spark, like an ember flaring up in cold ash. "I don't need money," she said, her voice low and hard, each word compressed like a spring. "And I don't sign things like that. Not anymore." The word anymore hung in the air between them, heavier than it should have been, thicker than a two-syllable word had any right to be. Cale tilted his head slightly to one side, a small motion almost unconscious, but his eyes narrowed. He'd heard it. Not just a refusal. There was something old in that word, something bitter, something buried so deep it was nearly invisible behind it. This story didn't end with an envelope. It had begun long before the accident, and Kyle, a man who lived by reading people, knew it. His gaze slid past Brianna's shoulder to the open cabin door. Inside, morning light fell across the wooden kitchen table. And there, among a scatter of a child's scribbled drawings and a few old mugs, lay a worn brown notebook with taped binding. Cale's eyes stopped on it for a single second. Then he looked away, but that second was enough. The cabin door opened wider, and Josie peeked out, both arms wrapped around her sketchbook against her chest like a small shield. "Mom, who are they?" Brianna's voice softened at once, so gentle it almost belonged to someone else. "Just travelers passing through, sweetheart. Go back inside." But Kale had already lowered himself, one knee touching the ground, bringing his face level with Josie's. The kingpin of the largest underground empire on the West Coast, the man whose nod could shut down an entire port, was kneeling in the dirt in front of a 7-year-old girl with a crooked ponytail and a smear of colored pencil on her cheek. "Your mom's very brave. You know that," he said, his voice still low, but lighter than it had been at any moment since he stepped out of the car. Josie tipped her head and looked at him with clear eyes that held not a single grain of suspicion. "My mom's always brave," she said, as if stating something as obvious as the sun rising in the east. And something softened in Cale Maddox's eyes. Not much, only a flicker, but it was enough for Brianna to see, and enough for her to know that behind the expensive suit and those steel-cold eyes, there was something that could still feel pain. Cale stood, brushed the dirt from his knee, then looked at Brianna one last time. "If you need anything," he said, "you know how to find me." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, walked back to the car, and the 3 Cadillacs backed down the narrow road, their engines murmuring like the breath of some large creature, then vanished behind the pines as quickly and quietly as they had arrived. Josie stood on the porch, watching the dust trail fade in the sunlight. "Mom," she asked, "why does he drive such a pretty car but his face is hurt?" Brianna looked at her daughter, then looked out at the dirt road where the dust had settled, where the pines had swallowed every trace of 3 glossy black cars as if they had never existed. "You live in a different world than he does, Josie," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, Brianna knew nothing was simple anymore. By that afternoon, the story had spread across the valley, and then far beyond its quiet borders. But it wasn't the simple version of someone saving a life and walking away. It was the version that had been squeezed, inflated, twisted into something that could sell advertisements. Someone had leaked a video clip. A hiker on the eastern slope had accidentally raised a phone at the exact moment the black SUV tore through the bridge railing, flew off the roadway, and plunged into the Flathead River. The footage was blurry and shaky, but still clear enough to show the column of water exploding upward like white fireworks, and a small figure swimming out into the current, straight toward the sinking wreck. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. News sites slapped on screaming headlines. Bloggers analyzed frame after frame, and then the titles began to appear, each one more poisonous than the last. Hero or accomplice, a suspicious closeness in the rescue of a kingpin. The reclusive woman on the mountain, what is she hiding? Accident or trap set for a mafia boss. They built strange stories. A woman living alone in the woods. No official work record. No digital footprint. No social media. Not a single photograph of her anywhere online. A vehicle plunges into the river right in front of her home. Too much of a coincidence, in their eyes. The valley that had been Brianna's refuge for 6 years became a sprung trap overnight. Reporters poured into town before midday, rented rooms at the only motel, parked television vans along the main road, knocked on every door, asking whether anyone knew what Brianna Kessler was really like. Hank's grocery store became the center of it all. Cameras set up outside. Reporters bought coffee, then asked every customer walking out whether they knew anything about the girl living up on the mountain. Hank called Brianna around 2 in the afternoon, his voice tangled with confusion and something that sounded like guilt. "Brianna, I'm sorry. They're saying terrible things, and people are starting to believe them." Brianna thanked him and hung up. There was nothing left to say. At the repair shop, Ron Whitfield pulled her aside at the end of the day. His eyes were sincere but firm, the eyes of a man trying to do something he didn't want to do. "Brianna, I don't believe any of those rumors," he said, "but customers are nervous. Someone called asking me why I'd hire a girl tied to the Mafia. I think you should take some time off, until things settle down." Brianna didn't argue. She simply packed her tools into the metal box, gently, one wrench at a time, one screwdriver at a time, motions worn into muscle through thousands of repetitions. Her hands stayed steady, but her jaw clenched so hard her temple muscle jumped beneath her skin. Then she walked out, got into her truck, and drove away. That evening, when she stopped at Hank's store to buy milk and bread for Josie, Brianna felt eyes clinging to her the moment she stepped through the door. Whispers slid down the aisles like ghosts, skimming along the shelves. A woman pushing a cart pulled her daughter close the instant Brianna passed, as if Brianna were a threat, as if her presence could infect them with something dangerous. Near the register, a man in a work jacket spoke loudly to his friend, not bothering to lower his voice, making sure she could hear. "Nobody just happens to be there when a Mafia car goes into the river. She definitely set the whole thing up." Brianna set her basket on the counter. Milk, bread, a box of cereal for Josie. She looked at the items for a second, then walked out of the store empty-handed. That night, heavy rain hammered the cabin roof in a steady rhythm, like funeral drums. Josie sat at the kitchen table, her plate of rice nearly untouched. She poked at the grains with her fork, pushing them from one side to the other, eyes lowered. Her eyes were red. "Mom," Josie said, her voice so small it was almost swallowed by the rain. "Why are people saying you're bad?" Brianna looked at her daughter. Josie had lost her mother before she was old enough to remember her grandmother's face. She had never asked for anything beyond a quiet life, and now even that was beginning to crack apart. Brianna wanted to explain that the world preferred loud, thrilling lies to plain truth, that people believed what they wanted because it was easier than thinking, that crowds didn't need evidence to condemn someone, because the condemnation itself was a kind of entertainment. But she couldn't say those things to a 7-year-old. She reached across the table and took her daughter's small hand. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, sweetheart. This will pass." Josie stared at her plate, her voice thin as thread. "Will it really pass, Mom?" Brianna didn't answer. She couldn't promise what she didn't believe herself. She stood, cleared the table, washed the dishes, and turned off the kitchen light. The room sank into darkness. Only the rain remained, and the soft breathing of Josie, who had fallen asleep in the chair, and the feeling of the outside world turning its back on Brianna 1 inch at a time. But the sharpest pain wasn't the headlines. It wasn't the whispers in the store. It wasn't the cold look from the woman pulling her child away. The sharpest pain was Josie's eyes, the eyes of a child looking at the mother she loved most in the world with confusion and fear, because she didn't understand why the person who had taught her kindness, honesty, and always doing the right thing was being treated like a criminal. That night, Brianna carried Josie to bed, tucked her in, kissed her forehead, then went back to her own room. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tapping steadily on the wooden roof, her fingers drifting without thought over the old scar on her wrist, a thin, pale line that had never truly disappeared, the mark from the night she climbed the barbed wire fence at the Ferris house 16 years earlier. The scar throbbed as if it were burning. History was repeating itself. Once again, she'd done the right thing. And once again, she was being punished for it. While Brianna lay staring at the cabin ceiling under the sound of rain, Hundreds of miles away, Cale Maddox sat in his office on the top floor of Maddox Holdings, looking out over San Francisco Bay, and he couldn't sleep either. The city spread beneath him like a carpet of lights, millions of points blinking in a thin veil of rain. But Cale saw nothing except his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. The bruise at his temple pulsed with a dull ache. The white bandage along his jaw had begun to soak through, a faint pink bloom seeping into the fabric. But it wasn't the wound on his face that kept him awake. It was memory. It returned without warning, as it always did, sliding quietly past the defenses he'd built over 20 years, then detonating in the middle of his chest. Cale was 16. The night before everything ended, father and son sat on the Oakland docks, their feet swinging over rotten boards, the smell of salt and motor oil braided together in the bay wind. Cargo ships moved slowly out on the water, navigation lights blinking red through the fog. Declan Maddox sat beside his son, a half-burned cigarette between two fingers, eyes fixed on the horizon where sea and sky merged into a blurred gray line. "I tried, Cale," he said, his voice low and tired, the voice of a man who had fought too long in a war he knew he could not win. "I tried to pull this family out of the dark, but there are people who don't want to see the light, because in the dark, they're richer." 16-year-old Cale asked, his voice still breaking somewhere between boy and man. "Then why don't you just leave?" Declan turned and looked at him, eyes so full of sadness, Cale would never forget them. The eyes of a father who knew he was about to lose everything, and still tried to smile so his son wouldn't be afraid. "Because if I go, who protects you? Someday, you'll bring this family into the light. I believe in you." 24 hours later, Declan Maddox was dead. 2 shots in the parking lot beneath the company building. No one was arrested. No one was charged. The case file was closed after 6 months with a simple conclusion: insufficient evidence. Cale stood beside his father's coffin at 16, wearing the first black suit of his life, and swore Declan's promise would not die with him. 20 years later, that promise still burned inside Cale's chest like an ember that never went out. He took control of the Maddox syndicate, expanded the empire, built Maddox Holdings into a legitimate front. But what he truly wanted wasn't more power. It was escape from it, to legalize the entire organization, to step out of the shadows, to finish what Declan didn't live long enough to do. And the man blocking him at every step, every day, every moment, was Warren Maddox, his uncle, a 58-year-old, with a smile that never reached his eyes, and hands that never got blood on them, but had ordered more blood spilled than anyone else in the organization. Cale dragged himself out of the memory and opened his laptop. The vehicle incident file sat on the screen, a technical report from the private mechanics team he trusted most. He read every line slowly, carefully, the way he read anything connected to life and death. The braking system had been tampered with. The brake fluid line had been partially cut, enough to function normally at low speed but fail completely once the vehicle passed a certain threshold, such as when it was flying across the Flathead Bridge in the middle of the night. Not an accident, an assassination attempt. Someone wanted him dead, and the list of people with both motive and the ability to do it was very short. Cale closed the technical report and opened the internal database. He typed the name he had tried not to think about all day: Brianna Kessler. The file loaded slowly, then line after line of information appeared, cold as ink on ice. Orphan, foster care, no official records, a daughter. And then one detail froze Cale in place, his fingers suspended over the keyboard. Brianna Kessler, age 21 to 23, mechanic employee at Ironclad Motors, Oakland, California. Ironclad Motors. Cale knew that name. He knew it better than almost anyone. Ironclad Motors was one of the Maddox organization's front operations, a link in the money laundering network Warren Maddox controlled directly. The woman who had saved Cale's life had once worked inside the web of his own family. Cale hadn't even finished absorbing the information when footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. No knock. No pause. The office door opened and Warren Maddox walked in the way he always walked into every room in his life, as if every door in the world belonged to him. 60, silver hair combed back, a tailored navy suit fitted cleanly over a body still solid, the body of a man who had never done hard labor with his own hands, and yet always looked ready for any fight. He smiled, the familiar smile Cale had seen 1,000 times, and never once had it touched the cold gray eyes above it. Working late again, Cale. Warren sat in the chair across from him without waiting to be invited, crossed one leg over the other, and rested his hands on the armrests like he was sitting on a throne. "I heard you went all the way up into the mountains to meet the girl who pulled you out of the river. Are you feeling better?" "I wanted to thank her in person," Cale said, calm, his eyes never leaving the screen even though he had closed every window before Warren could look. "I thought it was the right thing to do." "Of course," Warren nodded. Gentle, kind, like a good uncle making small talk with his nephew. "But you should be careful. People are making up stories. The more chaos there is, the more it helps the ones who want to take advantage." Then he stood and moved toward the door. One hand on the knob, he paused, as if he had just remembered something that didn't matter much. "Oh, and I hope you're not digging through old files. We've got more important things to worry about." The words were light as a passing breeze, sharp as a razor. Cale didn't move. His face stayed smooth as the Flathead River on a morning with no wind, not a ripple. "Why would I do that?" he asked, his tone so normal he surprised even himself. Warren laughed softly. "No reason. I just don't want you distracted by ghosts." Then he stepped out and closed the door so gently it made almost no sound at all. Cale remained still until the footsteps disappeared completely at the end of the hall. Then he opened the database again, printed the entire Brianna Kessler file, printed the Ironclad Motors file, printed the vehicle incident report, stacked everything neatly into a leather briefcase and locked it. Brianna Kessler had been inside Warren's network. She had seen something. She had been fired and threatened, and she was still alive, which meant someone had tried to silence her and failed, or someone had decided to let her live because they assumed an orphaned girl with no degree, no money, no one behind her would destroy herself before she ever became a threat. They were wrong. The call came at 9:43 that night. Brianna's old flip phone, the one she kept not because she needed it but because of habit, vibrated on the kitchen table among Josie's drawings and a coffee mug gone cold. She almost didn't answer, but something, maybe instinct, maybe the exhaustion that loosened her defenses more than usual, made her flip it open and bring it to her ear. "Miss Kessler." The voice was low and precise, every word placed exactly where it belonged. She recognized it immediately, even though she'd heard it only once. "K.L. Maddox. Where did you get this number?" "I have resources," K.L. replied, offering no further explanation. "I need to see you tonight. There's something important connected to Ironclad Motors." Brianna froze. The hand holding the phone went rigid, as if plunged into ice water. Ironclad Motors. That name. She hadn't heard anyone say it in 5 years. 5 years since the day she walked out of the garage gate with the notebook in her pocket and a threat ringing behind her. She had buried that name at the bottom of her memory, piled hundreds of layers of distance, silence, and time on top of it. And now a stranger had dug it up with a single sentence over the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," Brianna said, her voice flat, but her fingers clamped so hard around the phone her knuckles blanched. "You do," Cale said, "and I think someone doesn't want you to remember." Silence. Rain tapping steadily on the cabin roof. Brianna's breathing heavier than she wanted to admit. She was about to say something else. Maybe refuse. Maybe hang up. Maybe let out the kind of curse she had swallowed for 5 years. But before she could open her mouth, a sound came from Josie's room. Not screaming. Worse than that, it was breathing. Wrong breathing. Shallow, fast, wheezing, as if air were being forced through a tube that was too narrow. "Wait," Brianna said into the phone, then let it drop onto the table. She ran into Josie's room. Josie was sitting bolt upright in bed, both hands braced on the mattress, her chest heaving hard. Her face was pale under the nightlight, sweat soaking her hairline and sticking strands to her forehead. Her mouth was open, trying to pull in air, but every breath was thin and desperate, like trying to inhale through a thick cloth pressed over her throat. Asthma. A severe attack. Brianna lunged for the nightstand, yanked the drawer open, and groped for the inhaler. Her fingers found it. She pulled it out, shook it hard, pressed it to Josie's mouth, and clicked. Nothing. Empty. She clicked again. Empty. Completely empty. She flung it aside, sprinted into the bathroom, tore open the medicine cabinet. The backup inhaler. She always kept a backup here. Always. Never forgot. Because Josie was the one thing she wasn't allowed to fail. But the backup inhaler wasn't there. The shelf was bare. Only a bottle of menthol oil, a box of bandages, and the blank space where the inhaler should have been. Brianna ran back to Josie's room. Josie's lips were beginning to turn blue. Brianna's fingers felt like ice as she grabbed her daughter's small hand. Josie's eyes were wide with panic, looking at her mother with the eyes of a child drowning on dry land. A child who didn't understand why air, the thing that was always there, had suddenly abandoned her. Panic clenched Brianna's throat. She scooped Josie up, crushed her against her chest, and ran for the door. Her footsteps hammered the wooden floor, through the kitchen, across the porch, out into the rain, and that was when she saw the headlights. 2 fierce white beams flooded the yard, cutting through the rain like twin blades of light slicing open the dark. A black Cadillac screeched to a stop in front of the porch steps, tires sliding in mud, gravel spitting out to either side. The door flew open. Cale Maddox stepped out into the rain, his shirt soaked and clinging to him, hair flattened to his forehead, as if he'd been driving for hours through the storm without stopping. "Get in," he said. "Not an offer, not a request, a command. Right now." Brianna had no choice. She climbed into the back seat with Josie in her arms. Cale slid behind the wheel, shut the door, and hit the gas. The Cadillac tore down the dirt road, headlights splitting the night, rain slamming the windshield like handfuls of tiny bullets. A drive that normally took 40 minutes, Cale carved down to 25. He drove like someone who had spent his whole life outrunning death, eyes locked on the road, hands on the wheel as steady as hands on a weapon. In the back seat, Brianna held Josie against her, her palm pressed to her daughter's chest, feeling each weak breath, each rise and fall growing thinner. "Stay with me, Josie," she said, her voice cracking halfway through like breaking glass. "Stay with me, baby." The emergency room doors burst open. Nurses rushed out with a gurney. Brianna laid Josie down, her hands shaking so violently she no longer recognized them as her own. A doctor in green scrubs took over at once and set up a nebulizer. Within seconds, medication began to mist into Josie's lungs. Her chest rose and fell again, this time more evenly, more deeply. The purple on her lips faded, replaced by a fragile wash of pink. Brianna collapsed onto a plastic chair in the hallway, both hands covering her face, breath coming fast and ragged. Cale stood a few steps away, his back against the hospital wall, shirt soaked through, rain still dripping from his hair. He didn't speak. He didn't come closer. He simply stood there, silent, like a large shadow keeping watch in the stark white corridor. An hour passed. The doctor came out, face tired but relieved. "She's okay. We'll keep her overnight, but she'll make a full recovery." Brianna let out a long breath, a sound caught somewhere between laughter and a sob. She went straight into the room and sat beside Josie's bed. Josie lay on her side, eyes heavy beneath the thin fog of the oxygen mask. So small and fragile, she looked as if she could vanish if Brianna blinked for too long. "Mom," Josie whispered, her voice lighter than the wind outside the hospital window. "He drove us so fast. Is he an angel, Mom?" Brianna smiled. Tears spilled and ran down her cheeks, dropping onto the white sheet. But she still smiled, a trembling smile of someone who had just stepped back from a cliff and looked down. "Maybe, sweetheart," she whispered. "Maybe." Cale stood in the doorway of the room, not stepping inside, not saying a word. He watched the two of them, watched Brianna's hand gripping Josie's hand, watched the tear-soaked smile on the face of a woman who had pulled someone from death twice and still couldn't protect the most precious thing she owned. And in Brianna's mind, beneath the relief that hadn't even finished fading, another question began to rise, cold as night wind slipping through the hospital window. Why was the inhaler empty tonight of all nights? Why was the backup inhaler gone? She always checked. She always refilled. She always made sure. So who had been inside the cabin? Who had touched the things that belonged to her daughter? And if this wasn't coincidence, if someone was coming for her by coming for Josie, then they were still out there, and they were nowhere near finished. Josie slept. Her chest rose and fell steadily beneath the white sheet, the oxygen mask breathing out a thin mist that faded and returned with each small breath. Her tiny hand held a loose corner of the blanket, fingers still smudged with colored pencil that had missed a way. The hospital lights were cold and bright. The heart monitor beeped in a steady rhythm, like a countdown in a room where time had almost run out. Brianna sat beside the bed with her shoulders hunched, hands resting on her thighs, watching her daughter with the eyes of someone who had walked through hell and come back but still couldn't believe she had truly escaped. Cale stood on the other side of the bed with his back against the wall, arms folded across his chest. His rain-soaked shirt had started to dry, but it was still wrinkled and clinging at his shoulders, his hair damp and tangled on his forehead. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in silence, watching the child breathe. Brianna spoke first, her voice rough from crying, from shouting, from holding her breath too long on the drive to the hospital. "If it weren't for you, I would have lost my daughter." K.L. looked at her. His eyes held no comfort and no pity, only truth, bare and quiet. "You're not facing this alone anymore." Brianna wanted to give a bitter laugh at that. She'd heard promises like that her whole life, from people who always ended up leaving, or betraying, or vanishing. But tonight, she was too tired for bitterness, and the man in front of her had driven for hours through a night storm to get her child to a hospital. That action weighed more than any words. Cale pulled a plastic chair closer and sat facing Brianna, elbows on his knees, hands laced together. He spoke slowly, each word measured, like someone disarming a bomb one piece at a time. "Ironclad motors," he said, and she felt her body lock up even though she fought to stay calm. "The garage where you used to work. It wasn't a normal garage. It was a link in a money laundering network. Dirty money moved through it disguised as vehicle sales, restorations, parts that didn't exist. Millions of dollars every year, clean on paper and rotten underneath." Brianna said nothing. She sat with her fists clenched on her thighs, eyes lowered to the hospital's white tile floor. "The one who controls that network," Cale continued, "is Warren Maddox, my uncle." Brianna lifted her head. Her eyes met his, and under the sterile light of the hospital room, the two gazes held as if they were standing on opposite edges of the same abyss, looking down into the same dark. "You noticed things that didn't add up," Cale said. "You reported it, and you were fired immediately. Not because the garage manager decided it, but because Warren ordered it. You were a living witness to his laundering operation, and he believed firing you, threatening you, pushing you out into the street would be enough. He believed an orphaned girl with no degree, no money, no one behind her would vanish on her own, would fall apart, would never become a threat." Brianna stayed still. Pieces clicked into place like small sounds inside a lock turning open. Vehicles with no clear owners. Cash changing hands with no invoices. Plates changing again and again on the same car. Men showing up at night. The manager's threat. "If you open your mouth, no one will ever find you." It all assembled into a complete picture she'd been holding in fragments for 5 years. Fragments she never fit together because she didn't have enough of them, or because she was too afraid to try. Now Cale had set the final piece exactly where it belonged. Silence stretched between them. Only the monitor's beep and Josie's soft breathing. Then Brianna spoke, her voice so calm she surprised herself. "I still have the notebook." Cale looked at her, his eyes widened by a millimeter, a change so small most people would miss it. But for a man who had lived by reading others, it was real surprise. "The work notebook," Brianna said. "I wrote down everything when I was at Ironclad. Vehicle numbers, plates, service schedules, technical notes. Everything that came through that garage is in it." "You kept it," Cale said. Not a question, but the statement of someone trying to believe what he'd just heard. "For 5 years. Not because I knew it mattered," Brianna said, and her voice trembled for the first time, only slightly, like a string plucked too hard. "But because it was the only thing left from the only time I ever felt like I was someone. The first time in my life I had a job, a workbench, my name on a payroll. Coworkers saying my name every morning. That notebook isn't evidence. It's proof that I existed. That for a stretch of time, even if it was short, I wasn't a ghost." She stopped, took a long breath, then went on, eyes fixed on Cale. "It's in the kitchen drawer, between old bills and Josie's drawings. I'll give it to you." Cale leaned forward. "Why would you give it to me?" Brianna looked down at her hands, calloused hands, the cuts from the night she saved him still not fully healed, crossing over the old scar on her wrist from the night she climbed a barbed wire fence 12 years ago. 2 layers of scars, 2 lives, on the same hand. "Because you're the only person with enough power to do something," she said. "And because I'm tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of being afraid. Tired of pretending that notebook is just a notebook." Cale watched her in the white hospital light, watched the exhausted red-rimmed eyes that still refused to break, watched the calloused hands clench and release as if practicing how to let go of something held too long. He knew that if the numbers in that notebook matched the organization's internal transaction records, this wasn't only proof of money laundering. It could be a thread leading to the truth about Declan's death. It could be the weapon he had searched for 20 years to bring down Warren. But he also knew something else. If Warren found out the notebook existed, if he learned Brianna wasn't a ghost who had dissolved into nothing, but a living witness holding deadly proof, then Brianna and Josie would become targets, not the kind of threat delivered over the phone, not the kind of firing without explanation, the kind where people vanished in the night and were never found. Cale looked at Josie sleeping in the hospital bed, small beneath the white sheet, her chest rising steadily, her hand still loose around the blanket's corner. Then he looked back at Brianna. "I'll keep you safe," he said. "Both of you." Brianna didn't speak. She only nodded. A small, exhausted nod. The nod of someone who had run out of strength for doubt and decided, just this once, to trust another person. The safe house was a 2-story log home buried deep in the pine forest north of Kalispell, the kind of place that looked like an ordinary vacation cabin from the outside, but inside had steel doors, bulletproof glass, and a camera system Brianna didn't want to think about because it reminded her that the world she had just stepped into was dangerous enough to require things like that. Josie didn't notice. She adapted the way children adapt, quickly and completely, by finding the warmest corner of the room and spreading out her drawing supplies. On the second night in the safe house, Josie lay on her stomach on the living room's wooden floor, colored pencils scattered around her and half-finished drawings spread out in a messy halo. The ceiling light poured warm yellow over her brown hair tied off to one side, and Josie was coloring with the fierce focus of a 7-year-old when she decides what she's doing is the most important thing in the world. Cale walked into the living room. He had just finished a call with Paige upstairs, and his voice still carried the aftertaste of short, decisive orders. But when he saw Josie on the floor, his pace slowed. He stood for a second, then did something Connor Bryce, watching from the hallway, had probably never seen the head of the Maddox Syndicate do in 20 years. Cale sat down on the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat beside Josie, legs stretched out in front of him, his back resting against the base of the sofa, and watched her draw. Josie didn't look up. She kept coloring, her tongue slightly out at the corner of her mouth the way it always was when she was deeply focused. Blue pencil for the river, green for the pines, orange for the evening sky. Then 3 figures standing by the riverbank. The first figure was tall, with long hair, holding hands with the second figure, much smaller. The third figure stood beside them, the tallest, broad-shouldered, dressed in black. Josie finished, studied her drawing with the serious eyes of an artist judging her work, then lifted it and handed it to Cale. "I drew it for you," she said. Cale took the picture with both hands, gently, as if it were something fragile. He looked at the 3 figures by the river, the colored pencil lines trembling but sure, the bright orange sun in a sky only a child's imagination would dare to make so vivid. "Who is this?" he asked, even though he already knew. "This is family," Josie said, pointing to each one. "This is Mom, this is Josie, and this is Uncle Cale. Why did you draw me?" Josie looked at him with clear eyes, eyes that had never learned to lie, because she'd never had a reason to. "Because you saved Mom. And you saved Josie. Family is the people who save each other." Cale Maddox, the man whose nod could stop an entire port, the man who had seen blood, betrayal, and death more than most people ever would, sat on the living room floor of a safe house holding a 7-year-old girl's colored pencil drawing, and his eyes filled with tears. Not much, only a thin sheen, glimmering under the warm light, enough to turn his gaze from steel to glass for a single moment. He didn't wipe his eyes. He simply folded the drawing carefully, crease by neat crease, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his shirt, on the left side, as close to his heart as it could go. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower than usual. Josie grinned and turned back to her colored pencils, starting the next picture as if what had just happened was the most normal thing in the world. Because to her, it was. Family saves each other. That was all. Brianna stood in the doorway leading into the living room, one shoulder against the wooden frame, arms crossed. She had been there long enough to see everything, to see Cale sit down on the floor, to see Josie hand him the drawing, to see the steel eyes of a Mafia boss soften with tears over a child's colored pencil picture, and to see him tuck it into his shirt, closest to his heart, as carefully as if he were placing something sacred. She didn't speak. She didn't step in. She simply stood there, watching Cale's back and the brown crown of Josie's head bent over a new drawing. And inside Brianna's chest, something that had been frozen for 20 years, something that had hardened the night she held her mother's hand as it grew cold on the kitchen floor. Since the Ferris house, since the streets, since Travis, something she had believed had turned to stone forever, began to crack. The small conference room sat discreetly inside a law office on the edge of downtown San Francisco, the kind of room with no nameplate on the door, no windows, only a long wooden table, bright white overhead lights, and the thick, pressurized silence of places designed to keep secrets. Cale sat at one end of the table. Brianna sat at the other. Between them, Paige Holloway opened her laptop, plugged a USB drive into the port, and set the worn brown notebook on the table. It lay there under the white light, small and battered, its spine wrapped in tape, its paper edges yellowed, looking like any notebook anyone could buy at an office supply store for a few dollars. But Paige opened it with the careful hands of someone defusing a timed bomb. Page by page, line by line. The handwriting was small, neat, precise, written in black ballpoint. The kind of writing you get from someone who records details obsessively not because anyone told her to, but because the instinct for self-protection has seeped into her blood. License plates, dates, times in, times out, names of the men who delivered the vehicles, technical notes, parts replaced, repairs performed. Everything clean, legible, exact. Paige matched each entry against internal Maddox records Cale had provided on his laptop. She worked in silence, eyes moving back and forth between the notebook and the screen, fingers tapping softly on the keyboard, her expression darkening with every page she turned. It matched, line by line. The plates in the notebook matched plates registered under Warren's shell companies. The dates matched the transfer schedule inside the laundering system. The names matched low-level soldiers in the network. Millions of dollars in laundered transactions flowed through ironclad motors every year, clean on paper. But when set beside the internal files, the pieces locked together perfectly, like gears inside an engine. The money stream began in illegal operations, ran through ironclad disguised as vehicle sales and parts transactions, then poured into accounts Warren Maddox controlled directly. Paige flipped to a page near the end and stopped. Her finger landed on a single entry. She looked up at the laptop screen, then back to the notebook, then up again. Her eyes widened. "This page," she said, her voice low and controlled, but something beneath it trembled. The date and time here, 2:17 in the morning. A vehicle was brought into Ironclad for emergency handling. The plate number is written clearly. She turned the laptop toward Cale. On the screen was the file on Declan Maddox's assassination, the file Cale had read hundreds of times over 20 years. And in that file was the plate number of the vehicle identified at the parking lot scene the night Declan was shot. That plate number matched exactly the plate Brianna had written in her notebook. 2:17 in the morning. Only hours after Declan died, that vehicle was brought to Ironclad Motors, to be dealt with, to be erased. Paige looked at Cale, then at Brianna, then back at Cale. "Warren arranged his own brother's assassination," she said, each word heavy as lead. "And he used Ironclad to wipe the trail. The vehicle used that night was brought into the garage, dismantled or altered beyond recognition, and every official record was scrubbed. But they couldn't erase the notebook of a 23-year-old mechanic working the night shift, because they didn't know it existed." Silence dropped into the room like an iron curtain. Cale sat completely still, eyes fixed on the open notebook on the table, on the small, tidy handwriting on the yellowed page. Brianna's handwriting at 23. The handwriting of a young woman newly off the streets, newly holding her first real job, sitting in a garage at 2 in the morning recording a plate the way she recorded every other plate, because it was habit, because it was how she protected herself, because no one had ever taught her anything else except to write everything down. She didn't know that vehicle had just been used to kill someone. She didn't know the man who was killed was the father of the man sitting across from her 20 years later in this room. She only wrote it, in black ink, in careful letters, with the survival instinct of an orphaned child who had learned that writing everything down was the only way the world couldn't deny you were there. Brianna sat in silence, watching Cale. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw his interlaced fingers go white at the knuckles. She saw eyes that were looking at the notebook, but not really looking at the notebook at all. Eyes that were staring into a night 20 years ago, the night a 16-year-old boy stood beside his father's coffin and swore the promise would not die with him. "If you expose this," Brianna said softly, cautiously, like someone walking over broken glass, "the organization will collapse. Everything. Everything your father built." Everything you've kept alive for 20 years. Cale looked up. His gaze met hers. In those eyes, there was no longer the coldness of a mafia boss. No longer the calculation of a man who had steered an underground empire since he was 20. There was only clarity, transparent and absolute, the look of someone who made the decision long before the question was ever asked. My father wanted me to bring this family into the light, he said. This is the only way. Warren struck back before Cale could move, because Warren Maddox wasn't the kind of man who waited. He was the kind who hit first, hit lightly, hit exactly where it hurt most, then smiled and watched to see what the victim would do. The first blow arrived in the form of a teddy bear. Connor Bryce found it while doing a security sweep around the hospital where Josie was still being kept overnight for observation after the asthma attack. A small gift box wrapped in pink paper sat on the pediatric reception counter, addressed to Josie Kessler. Inside was a white plush bear, the soft, expensive kind any child would love, and a small card written in black ink, elegant slanted handwriting, polite as a grandfather's well-wish to his granddaughter. Get well soon, Grandpa Warren. Connor brought the box to Brianna. She opened the card, read it, and blood rushed to her face so fast her skin went from pale to red in less than a breath. Her hand crushed the card until it wrinkled. But she didn't scream. She didn't smash anything. She didn't say a word. She only stood there staring at the white bear in its box, staring at the stitched-on smile, and understood that smile wasn't a blessing. It was a message. I know where you are. I know where your daughter is. I can reach her whenever I want. The second blow came through the phone, aimed straight at Cale. A text from Warren's private number. Brief, courteous, precise, like everything Warren did. You know, that girl has a very interesting past. Orphan, foster care, abuse records, the streets. It would be a shame if the press learned those details. A girl with a past like that, who would believe her? Who would treat her little notebook as reliable evidence? If you stop now, I'll keep everything quiet. Everything. Cale read the message in the safe house office, alone, the desk lamp cutting his face into light and shadow. He read it twice, 3 times. Then he set the phone down on the desk, gently, controlled, like placing a grenade with the pin already pulled. Warren wasn't threatening to kill Brianna. He was doing something worse. He was threatening to expose her, drag every shattered piece of her life into the light. Foster care files, abuse reports, the years on the street, all the scars Brianna had spent her whole life hiding. Turn her from a witness into a joke. Turn the notebook from evidence into the worthless scribbling of an unstable woman with an untrustworthy past. Warren didn't need to kill Brianna. He only needed to ruin her in public, and everything she held would become worthless on its own. Cale faced a choice. Keep going, and Brianna would be destroyed. Stop, and Warren would walk away. 20 years of waiting, 20 years of searching for proof, and now Cale had it in his hands. But the price was the dignity of the woman who had saved his life, and the childhood of the 7-year-old who had drawn him into a family picture. Cale looked down at the inside pocket of his shirt, where Josie's colored pencil drawing was still folded neatly. 3 figures by the river. Mom, Josie, and Uncle Cale. Family is the people who save each other. He picked up the phone and called Warren. Bayside Shipping Port, Cale said, his voice flat as still water. I'm transferring full control to you. The paperwork will be done within 24 hours. Silence on the other end. Then Warren's soft laugh, the satisfied purr of a cat watching a mouse walk into a trap on its own. You're always smart, Cale. What's Bayside worth? 30 million. 40. Enough for you to stay quiet about the girl, Cale said. Not one word, not one article, not one leak. She and her daughter are untouchable. That's the deal. The deal, Warren repeated, sweetly. Of course, sweetheart. Cale didn't tell Brianna. She didn't need to know someone had just traded away a shipping port, his largest strategic asset, his most important advantage inside the organization, to protect her dignity. She didn't need to know the head of the Maddox syndicate had just cut off his own right arm because of a colored pencil drawing and a 7-year-old simple sentence. Family saves each other. 2 days later, Cale met Warren in person to sign the transfer documents. Warren's office sat on the 38th floor of the Maddox building, 2 floors below Cale's office, but twice as large. The kind of office owned by a man who didn't need to sit at the top because he knew he controlled everything from underneath. Warren sat behind a dark wood desk, rolling a pen between his fingers, the familiar smile on his mouth. You know, he said as Kael set the pen down after signing. "I've always thought you were like your father. Too idealistic. Too willing to believe in people. Declan was the same, and look how he ended up." Kael stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked straight into his uncle's eyes. "You think you're a hero?" Warren asked, tilting his head, his voice still sweet but his eyes colder than any winter. "You think this makes you better than me?" "I'm not trying to be a hero," Kael said, calm, each word placed like a stone in a wall. "I'm finishing my promise to my father, and for the first time in 20 years, for the first time in Kael's memory, the smile vanished from Warren Maddox's face. Not fading, not thinning. Gone completely, like someone had flipped off a light switch, revealing a face Kael had never truly seen. The real face, cold, empty, and more dangerous than any smile. Paige didn't mean to reveal it. It happened on the afternoon of the 4th day at the safe house, when Brianna walked past the upstairs office and heard Paige's voice on the phone inside. The door was cracked open, just enough for the words to slip into the hallway. "The Bayside transfer paperwork is complete," Paige said, her tone professional and even, like she was reading a report. "Kael signed yesterday. Full control of the shipping port now belongs to Warren. In exchange, Warren has agreed not to expose Kessler's foster care records to the media. That's the deal." Brianna stopped in the middle of the hall. Her feet wouldn't move, not because she meant to listen, because her name had just been spoken, and beside her name were the words transfer and in exchange and deal, words she'd heard enough in her life to know they always came with loss. She stood there with her back against the hallway wall, heart racing, staring at the empty air in front of her while her mind processed each word, one by one. Kael gave up Bayside Shipping Port, an asset worth tens of millions of dollars, the biggest strategic advantage he had inside the organization, in exchange for Warren's silence about her past, in exchange for her dignity, and he hadn't told her a single word. Brianna slid down the wall and sat on the hallway floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. She sat there a long time. She didn't know how long. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe half an hour. Time stopped meaning anything when a mind was trying to swallow something it had no frame of reference to understand. Because in 31 years of Brianna Kessler's life, no one had sacrificed anything for her. Not that no one ever wanted to. No one had made it in time, or no one had chosen to. Boyd Kessler, her father, sacrificed nothing. He left into the snow and never came back. He chose the bottle and the dark road over a 6-year-old girl sitting beside her mother's body on the kitchen floor. Ada, her mother, had wanted to protect her, but she didn't get the chance. She died before Brianna was old enough to remember her face clearly, leaving her one old photograph and a mother-shaped emptiness nothing in the world could ever fill. 4 foster homes, and none of them sacrificed. The first gave her back because they couldn't afford another mouth. The second treated her like unpaid labor. The third, Carl Ferris's house, took something Brianna never spoke about and left her with a scar she never explained. The fourth never existed, because Brianna never allowed it to exist again. And Travis. Travis gave her roses the first week, gentleness the second, and fists by the third. Travis sacrificed nothing except his own restraint. No one. In 31 years. Not a single person. And now a man she'd known for less than 10 days. A mafia boss. Someone the world labeled dangerous, cold, heartless, had traded away tens of millions of dollars, had cut off his most important strategic limb, to protect her dignity. Not her life, her dignity. The thing most people didn't consider worth anything at all. The thing Warren meant to shred and throw into the headlines to turn her into a joke. Kael had chosen to lose a shipping port, rather than let Brianna lose the only thing she still had left after 31 years. The right to be herself without being judged by her past. And he hadn't said a word. He hadn't bragged. He hadn't demanded gratitude. He had simply done it, then stayed silent, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. That night, Brianna found Kael on the 2nd floor balcony of the safe house. He stood there with both hands braced on the wooden rail, looking out at the dark pine forest beneath a sky full of stars. The night wind carried the scent of sap and wet earth. He didn't turn when he heard her footsteps, but his shoulders shifted slightly, making room, a small, almost unconscious gesture. Brianna stepped beside him and rested her hands on the railing too, eyes on the same darkness. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice low, not angry, not accusing, only the heavy truth of someone who had just understood something too large for language. Cale didn't turn. You're right. I didn't have to. Then why did you? Silence. Wind moving through the pines. Leaves whispering like a distant sea. A nightbird called somewhere in the dark. Then Cale spoke, his voice lower than usual, softer than usual. A voice Connor Bryce, watching through the glass door, had probably never heard the head of the Maddox syndicate use, because you jumped into an icy river to save a complete stranger. You didn't ask his name. You didn't demand anything. You didn't need to know who he was. You just saw someone drowning and you jumped. He paused. You deserved someone to do the same for you. Brianna didn't speak. She stood there beside a man who had been a stranger 10 days ago, both of them staring into the same night sky, but seeing it through eyes shaped by entirely different ruins. He was the 16-year-old boy who lost his father in a parking lot and inherited an empire of blood. She was the 6-year-old girl who held her mother's hand as it turned cold on a kitchen floor and inherited nothing at all. Two shattered pasts, standing shoulder to shoulder on a wooden balcony, looking up at the same stars. No more words, no need for more. And in that moment, in the night wind and the pine scent and the silence louder than anything spoken, Brianna Kessler decided to trust Cale Maddox. Completely. Not because he was strong, not because he was rich, not because he was a kingpin who could command the underworld, but because he chose to be soft for her. The emergency meeting was called for 8 o'clock Thursday morning. When Cale stepped into the conference room on the 40th floor of Maddox Holdings, it was already packed. Expensive suits sat around the long, polished table, tablets glowing, coffee steaming in porcelain cups. Lawyers lined up along the wall with folders pressed tight to their chests. Branch heads from across the West Coast sat in rows, each one representing a link in the empire the Maddox family had built over 4 decades. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, laying a cold sheen across Warren Maddox's shoulders as he sat at the head of the table, back straight, fingers laced, his familiar smile in place, confident as a man sitting on a throne no one could topple. Cale entered last, carrying a slim tablet and a leather briefcase. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the front of the room and connected his tablet to the large screen on the wall. The entire room turned toward him at once. Warren kept smiling. Cale, good. We need to address the media problem and shape the message after the accident. I agree, Cale said. Then he tapped the screen. The display flickered and the first image appeared. A page from the worn brown notebook. Small neat handwriting in black ink. License plates, dates, times in, times out. Beside it was a comparison chart against Maddox internal transaction records. Every number matching perfectly, highlighted in red. A hiss of murmurs cut across the room. Warren stopped smiling for a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned, but his eyes changed. Cale moved to the next page. Laundered transactions through ironclad motors. A money stream of millions flowing from illegal operations. Through the garage disguised as vehicle sales. Then into accounts Warren controlled. Next page. Next page. Each one was a brick in a wall of proof. And the wall was rising, thickening, closing in around the man at the head of the table. One board member shot to his feet, face gone white, snapped his portfolio shut, and bolted for the door. Then the second, then the third. In less than 2 minutes, half the room was empty. Cale didn't stop. He projected the next page. The one page had marked separately. The entry dated and timed at 2:17 in the morning. The plate of the vehicle brought into Ironclad for urgent handling only hours after Declan Maddox was shot dead in the parking lot. The plate matched the case file exactly. Warren slammed his hand on the table. The sound cracked across the room like thunder. "What are you doing, Cale?" he demanded, the words almost forced through his teeth. "Are you trying to destroy the company? Destroy everything your father built." Cale looked straight into Warren's eyes, those cold gray eyes he'd watched for 20 years without ever seeing the truth behind them. "No, Uncle Warren," he said, calm, each word heavy as stone. "You destroyed this family. The day you killed my father." The room went silent. No one breathed. No one moved. Only the faint hum of the projector and the pale blue light from the screen washing over their faces. Then the thing Cale feared most happened. Warren didn't shout. He didn't slam the table again. He became calm. Calm in a way that felt wrong. He leaned back in his chair, smiled. The smile Cale had seen 1,000 times. The smile of a snake before it bites. Then reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his phone. His finger slid across the screen. Warren was calling someone. or texting someone. And Cale understood instantly, with the instinct of a man who had lived his whole life among dangerous people, that the call wasn't for lawyers. It was for someone outside, someone close to Brianna and Josie. Cale looked at Connor Bryce standing by the door. Their eyes met. One single nod, small and fast. Connor slipped out of the conference room without a sound, his phone already at his ear before he cleared the doorway. Cale stood in the middle of the room, between the evidence glowing on the screen and Warren smiling across from him, and a choice sharp as a blade lay right in front of his chest. Stop. Protect Brianna and Josie. Let Warren walk. Or keep going. Expose everything. And trust that Connor would get there in time. Cale turned his head toward the glass wall of the conference room. Outside, in the reception area, Brianna sat on a sofa, with Josie beside her, legs swinging, sketchbook in hand. Brianna looked straight into Cale's eyes through the glass. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't afraid. Her gaze was calm and clear and steady, the gaze of someone who had survived everything life threw at her and still stood upright. She nodded. Small, almost invisible, but Cale saw it, and he heard what she didn't say out loud. Keep going. Cale turned back. He displayed the final page, the page with the license plate, the date and time, and Warren's approval signature on an ironclad handling order, the final proof tying Warren Maddox to the assassination of his own brother. At the same time, somewhere outside the building, Paige Holloway had finished transferring the entire package of evidence to the FBI 2 hours earlier. The conference room door opened. It wasn't Connor returning. 4 federal agents in gray suits, FBI badges pinned to their chests, stepped into the room. Their footsteps were even and certain and cold, the footsteps of people arriving to end something. Warren Maddox looked at them, looked at the handcuffs in the lead agent's hand, looked back at Cale. And for the second time in Cale's life, the smile vanished from Warren Maddox's face. This time, it didn't come back. Warren was cuffed right there at the head of the table where he'd sat for 20 years as if it were a throne. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He only stood and let the agents lead him away, eyes fixed straight ahead, his face empty as a room that had been stripped of furniture. Outside the conference room, Josie gripped her mother's hand, eyes wide as she watched the gray-suited men escort the silver-haired old man past them. "Mom," she whispered, "did the bad man get arrested?" Brianna looked at her daughter, her eyes wet but her voice steady. "Yes, baby. The bad man got arrested. Because Uncle Cale was brave." Brianna knelt to Josie's level and held both small hands in hers. "Because a lot of people were brave, sweetheart, including Mom." The car stopped on the dirt road, leading into a small cemetery on the outskirts of Sacramento late in the afternoon. When the sun had begun to tilt west, and the light stretched across the rows of headstones like a thin golden cloth laid over silence, Brianna sat in the car a long time before she opened the door. Her hands rested on her thighs, her fingers absently turning the edge of a drawing that had been folded carefully in her lap. Josie's colored pencil picture. 3 figures by a river. Mom, Josie, and Uncle Cale. Under an orange sky, only a child's imagination would dare to make that bright. 25 years. 25 years since the winter night. She sat beside her mother on the kitchen floor, holding a hand that grew colder and colder. 25 years she hadn't come back here. Not because she forgot. Because she was afraid. Afraid that standing in front of her mother's grave, she would have to face everything that came after that night. Foster care, Carl Ferris, the streets, Ironclad, Travis, and she would have to admit her life had become the thing Ada never wanted it to become. Afraid she would kneel there and have nothing to say except "I'm sorry." But today was different. Today she hadn't come with only an apology. Brianna opened the car door and stepped out. Sacramento's afternoon air was warmer than Montana's, carrying the smell of dry grass and sun-heated earth. The cemetery was small and plain, the kind meant for people who couldn't afford to buy plots in more polished places. A low iron fence, grass sprouting in patches between the walkways, a few old oak trees casting shade over stones that had grayed with time. Brianna walked between the rows, eyes reading names, dates, faint carved lines. She didn't need a map. She remembered the place, even after 25 years. She remembered because there are things the body remembers even when the mind tries to forget. Her steps slowed, then stopped in front of a small, low marker, no higher than her knee, made of gray stone. Ada Marie Kessler, born 1972, died 1998, forever loved, simple, Clean, like Ada's life. Too short, too quiet, remembered by too few. Grass grew thick around the base of the stone, bright green, as if the earth were trying to hold it in the only way it knew. No flowers. No sign anyone had visited in years. Brianna knelt down. Her knees met damp ground. She laid Josie's drawing on the headstone, gently, carefully, the way you lay a newborn into a crib. 3 figures by the river, orange sky, blue water, and the round, smiling faces Josie had drawn on each one, smiles bigger than the faces themselves. Because in a child's world, happiness doesn't need perfect proportions. "Mom," Brianna said, and her voice cracked on the first 2 words, cracking like a porcelain cup hitting the floor, not loud, just splitting into small pieces that could never be fitted back together. "I finally gave your granddaughter the childhood you always wanted to give me." She stopped and took a trembling breath, eyes on the gray stone where her mother's name was carved beneath a thin film of moss. "Josie has a home, a school, people who protect her, colored pencils and sketchbooks and orange skies in her drawings. She has something I never had, a childhood." Tears ran, but Brianna didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, onto the dirt, onto the grass, onto the stone that carried the name of the woman who had loved her the most and stayed the shortest. "I'm sorry I came so late, Mom. I'm sorry for 25 years. I'm sorry you didn't get to see your daughter grow up. Didn't get to see Josie. You would love Josie, Mom. She draws so well. She asks so many questions. She tilts her head when she thinks, just like you in the only picture I have left." Brianna bowed her head, her forehead nearly touching the stone, her shoulders trembling softly. "I'm sorry you didn't get to see." Behind her, Cale stood a few steps back in silence. He didn't come close. He didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort her. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, posture straight, eyes lowered to Brianna's brown hair shaking in the afternoon wind. Then he took 1 step forward, only one, and set his hand on her shoulder, lightly, no squeeze, no pull, just resting there, saying, "I'm here in the only way a man who didn't trust words could say it." Brianna didn't turn. She didn't need to see to know whose hand it was. She lifted her own hand and laid it over his on her shoulder. 2 hands resting together on the shoulder of an orphaned woman kneeling at her mother's grave on the outskirts of Sacramento. Her hands were calloused from engines and chainsaws, from 12 years of fixing everything broken in her life with her own hands. His hand was scarred from fights, from 20 years steering an empire he had never wanted to inherit. 2 hands, 2 lives, holding steady on the shoulder of a woman who was, for the first time in 31 years, allowing herself to be fragile in front of someone else. Small footsteps pattered up the path. Josie appeared, shoes muddy, cheeks flushed from running, one fist clenched around a small yellow wildflower she had picked along the road, the kind that grows without a name, without anyone planting it, rising on its own between rocks and dust, stubborn and brave, just like her mother. Josie knelt beside Brianna and placed the flower on the stone as carefully as if it were treasure. "Grandma," Josie said, her voice clear and serious, as if Grandma were standing right there and Josie simply couldn't see her. "I'm Josie. Mom says you were really pretty. Mom says you smiled a lot. I smile a lot too, and I draw well. My teacher says so." Brianna looked at her daughter, at the yellow wildflower resting on the headstone beside the colored pencil drawing, at the name Ada Marie Kessler carved into stone, and she wrapped Josie in her arms, tight, the way she had held her mother's hand on that winter night 25 years ago and refused to let go. But this was different. This time what she held didn't grow cold. It was warm. It was alive. It was breathing, laughing, asking if Grandma liked flowers. Brianna's tears fell, but not from pain, not from loss, not from 25 years of distance, from lightness. Lightness like, for the first time in her life, she had finally set down the thing she'd been carrying on her shoulders since she was 6. 2 days later, the familiar sound of an engine carried up the dirt road to the cabin, but this time it was different. Not the deep, powerful growl of 3 glossy black Cadillacs, just the sound of a normal rental car, a mid-sized sedan anyone could pick up at an airport counter. Cale Maddox drove alone. No Connor Bryce behind him. No men in black suits carrying leather portfolios. No thick envelope. No non-disclosure agreement. Just a paper grocery bag on the passenger seat, the kind from an ordinary store. One corner damp where a carton of tomato sauce had tipped. He wore a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, jeans, and leather shoes dusted with Montana dirt. If you didn't know who he was, you would have thought he was just an ordinary man coming by for a weekend visit. He knocked. The wooden door opened and Josie stood there, her face lighting up as if someone had flipped a switch behind those clear brown eyes. "You came back," she shouted, then spun and ran into the kitchen, calling at the top of her lungs. "Mom, Uncle Cale brought food." Brianna appeared at the end of the hallway with an oily rag in her hand, hair tied up high, a thin streak of grease on her cheek she didn't know was there. She looked at Cale, at the dusty rental parked beside her battered old pickup, at the grocery bag in his hand, and surprise flickered across her eyes before she stepped aside. "Come in." Dinner happened in the small kitchen, with a ceiling low enough that Cale had to duck slightly under the beam. Pasta with marinara sauce Cale made himself, and he made it better than Brianna expected. Honestly, better than anything she had ever cooked in this kitchen. Hot, crisp garlic bread. A salad dressed in olive oil that Josie carefully pushed all the tomatoes to the edge of her plate and ate the rest with the satisfied expression of a 7-year-old food critic. Josie talked nonstop. She showed off her newest drawing, a cat that she insisted was a tiger but needed more stripes, then a drawing of the cabin with the river in front, then a picture of Uncle Cale driving very fast in the rain that Josie called the angel driving picture. Cale listened to every word, leaned in to examine every drawing, asked why the sky was purple, why the river had sharks, why the cat was bigger than the cabin, his voice earnest and serious, as if those questions mattered more than any $1,000,000 negotiation he'd ever sat through. Josie explained each detail with wild excitement, hands flying, tomato sauce smeared at the corner of her mouth she didn't bother to wipe. Brianna watched them from the far end of the small wooden table, a glass of water in her hand. Silent. She watched a Mafia boss bend his head to listen, while her daughter explained how sharks could live in a river if they wanted to, and she thought this might be the strangest and the most beautiful dinner this kitchen had ever held. Josie fell asleep at 8 o'clock, curled up in bed with the angel driving picture under her pillow, because she insisted it would help her dream good dreams. Brianna tucked the blanket around her, kissed her forehead, then stepped out onto the porch. Cale was already there in an old wooden chair, both hands around a mug of coffee, eyes on the river flowing quietly under the stars. Tonight, the Montana sky was so clear you could see the Milky Way, a faint, pale band stretching across the darkness like someone had tossed a handful of glitter onto black velvet. Brianna sat in the chair beside him, poured herself coffee, and the two of them sat in silence for a long time, listening to crickets, the soft rush of water, the wind moving through the pines. "I lost faith in people a long time ago," Brianna said, her voice soft, not sad, only the truth spoken in the voice of someone who had made peace with it long ago. "After everything that happened, after my mom, after foster care, after Ironclad, after Travis, I believed doing the right thing only got you crushed, that this world punishes good people and rewards the ones who know how to stay quiet." Cale looked at her, the warmth of the coffee between his hands. "And now?" Brianna was quiet for a moment, eyes on the river where starlight broke on the surface into 1,000 small points that rocked with the current. "Now," she said slowly, as if weighing each word before letting it go, "maybe it still matters. Maybe doing the right thing still matters, even when it hurts, even when it takes everything. Because you bet everything, the organization, the assets, your life, not because you had to, because you chose to." Cale watched the river, then looked down into his mug, then up at the sky. "My father said something to me the night before he died," he said, his voice lower, softer, the kind of voice only darkness and running water get to hear. He said, "One day you'll bring this family into the light." I held on to that line for 20 years. It was the only thing that kept me awake when everything around me was dark. He paused. "But I can't bring anyone into the light if the organization doesn't have people willing to tell the truth. Maddox Foundation, the first legal step, needs someone to run the child protection programs for kids in the foster care system. It isn't glamorous. It won't be a sky-high salary. But it matters, and I can't think of anyone more right than you." Brianna turned to him. "I'm not good at politics. I don't know how to sit in boardrooms. I'm a mechanic." "Good," Cale said, and something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and rare, like sunlight breaking through clouds on a rainy day. "I don't need a politician. I need someone who isn't afraid of the truth. Someone who wrote everything down in that notebook when no one told her to. Someone who kept it for 5 years not because she knew it was a weapon, but because it was proof she had existed. Someone who jumped into an icy river to save a stranger without even asking his name. Brianna looked out at the Flathead River glittering with starlight. The river where everything had started. Where she pulled him up out of the water without knowing her life would never be the same again. "I'll do it," she said. Cale nodded. Then he lifted his eyes to the sky. Starlight reflected in eyes Brianna had once seen as cold as steel, but now only saw as deep. "You know," he said, his voice so soft it was meant only for the two of them between the river and the wind. "My father said bring the family into the light." I don't think he meant only the Maddox family. 1 year later, the new Maddox Foundation building opened on a crystal-clear autumn morning. It wasn't tall. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a 40-story glass tower like the old Maddox Holdings headquarters. It was smaller, more modest, built from reclaimed wood, with large floor-to-ceiling windows that let natural light pour into every corner, as if the architect understood this place had been born to bring things into the light, so light had to be everywhere. Inside, the crowd filled the hall. Human rights attorneys, social workers, families of children in the foster care system, child advocates, reporters with cameras ready. And in the front row, Brianna sat beside Josie, her daughter in a new floral dress, hair pulled into a neat ponytail, legs swinging above the floor, her sketchbook hugged to her chest the way it always was. Cale stood at the podium in a gray suit, not the powerful black of a kingpin, but something lighter, softer, as if the man wearing it had changed too. He looked out at the room, held silence for a second, then began. "A year ago, I almost lost my life. Not because of bad luck, not because of a random accident, but because someone in my own family chose power over what was right, chose darkness over light." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before stopping on the front row. "But a woman who was a complete stranger jumped into an icy river and pulled me out. She didn't know who I was. She didn't need to. She only saw someone drowning, and she jumped." His voice dropped, slower now, heavier. "This foundation exists because of people like her, people who grew up with no one to protect them, and still chose to protect someone else. People the world turned its back on, who refused to turn their back on the world." The entire hall rose to its feet. Applause rolled like surf, spilling from the front rows to the back, up to the balcony, out into the hallway. Brianna stayed seated, eyes fixed on Cale. She didn't stand. She didn't clap. She only gave a small nod, a nod only the two of them understood. The same nod she had given him through the glass wall on the day Warren was arrested. At dusk, the three of them drove back to Montana. The Flathead River glittered under the sunset, gold turning to amber, turning to honey as it melted into the horizon. Brianna pushed her old wooden boat out onto the water, the same boat she still used for fishing in the mornings, the same boat that had witnessed the day the SUV plunged into the river and everything began. Josie brought her newest airplane drawing, on thicker paper this time, brighter colors, a silver plane gleaming as it flew through an orange sky. She set it gently on the surface. The paper wobbled for a second. Then the evening breeze nudged it into the current, drifting toward the middle. Steady and soft, like breathing, Cale stood on the bank with his hands in his pockets, watching the drawing float farther away. "I used to think power was control," he said, still watching the small picture bobbing on the golden water. "Holding everything, controlling everyone." Brianna stood beside him. "And now I think power is knowing when to let go, knowing when to trust someone else to do what's right." Josie ran back, shoes soaked from waiting at the edge, her face bright with joy. She picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. It hit once, twice, then sank. Ripples spread out in concentric circles, widening and widening until they reached the far bank. "Do people really change?" Josie asked, watching the ripples with the serious eyes of a child trying to understand the world. Cale looked at Brianna. Brianna looked at Josie. "They can try," Cale said, "and sometimes that's enough." The evening wind skimmed the surface, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight broke through clouds and laid gold across the ripples. Brianna spoke softly, almost only loud enough for him to hear between the river and the wind. "You pulled me out of the dark." Cale looked at her. "You pulled me out of the river, so we're even." "Not yet," he said, and that rare smile touched the corner of his mouth again. Light and warm, like the late afternoon sun spreading over the water in front of them. "But this is a beginning." In her new office at the Maddox Foundation, Brianna sat at her desk and looked out through the wide window. On the bookshelf behind her, the worn brown notebook sat inside a small glass display. Not because it was legal evidence anymore, the original was already in the FBI file, but because it was proof she had existed, and the fact that she existed had changed everything. Beside the display was an old photograph of Ada smiling in Sacramento sunlight, the only picture Brianna still had from childhood. And beside Ada's photo was a picture of Josie, grinning wide, sketchbook in her arms, colored pencil stains all over her fingers. Her phone buzzed. A message from Josie, sent from the school tablet the Maddox Foundation funded for an arts program for kids. "Mom, I got an A in art. My teacher says I draw beautifully like you." Brianna smiled and typed back, "I'm proud of you. I'll be home early." She leaned back in her chair and looked out at San Francisco Bay glittering in the afternoon light. 32 years old. A year ago, she was a mechanic living in a riverside cabin, trusting no one, needing no one, wanting only peace. Her whole life she had believed doing the right thing only meant losing everything. She had been wrong. Truth always matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, it wins. The Flathead River glittered under the sunset every evening, the surface smooth as glass, then rippling when the wind rose, then smoothing again, then rippling again, like the breathing of a living thing that had witnessed everything and kept flowing anyway. Brianna Kessler saved a life and found her own. Cale Maddox lost an empire but bought back his soul and fulfilled the promise he made to his father. And Josie, a child who grew up without grandparents, without a father, now had a future built on truth, protected by integrity, where the colored pencil drawing of 3 people by the river was no longer a dream, but real. This story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It is being afraid and still doing what's right. That sometimes the person who saves us isn't a superhero, but an ordinary person who decides to jump into cold water because they can't stand by and watch someone drown. That truth can be buried, threatened, silenced for years, but it always rises, like an SUV sunk at the bottom of a river, like a notebook tucked in a kitchen drawer, like a wildflower pushing up through stone. And that justice, even when it comes late, is still worth fighting for. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to support it, share it with anyone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss the journeys ahead. We'd love to know how you feel about Brianna and Cale's story. What did it make you think of in your own real life? Have you ever had a moment where doing the right thing cost you? Share in the comments below. We read every story from the deepest parts of your hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.